Joining us this morning, John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and senior director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. John, thank you for being with us this morning. Do you think Ukraine made the right assessment here on Putin?
Well, there's no doubt about it. Mr. Putin is ready to have a negotiation once Ukraine concedes that Russia can annex significant chunks of Ukrainian territory and still come back for more. So Zelensky made the right decision on the proposed ceasefire.
So what is Putin's next move? Clearly, he is showing some indication he's interested in finding a conclusion to this.
Well, there's no question the Russian military has performed dreadfully. And Russia's attack on Ukraine's infrastructure has only increased Western support and military supplies to Ukraine. So the waters around Putin are getting higher. The waves are getting higher. So I think his 36-hour proposed ceasefire was a little bit of a probe to see if, in fact, he could get a ceasefire in place, which is what he's really after.
So he couldn't. Now what?
Well, I think they're talking now about a Russian offensive and more attacks on on Ukrainian infrastructure and civilians. And that will also fail because Ukraine's military is in a superior position, especially because they have significant, although to my mind not enough, advanced Western weapons.
I'm curious about the situation that we're seeing in the eastern Donbass region, particularly the city of Bakhmut. There has been so much focus on maintaining hold of that city, especially in the recent hours from Ukraine. Why is that such a critical point in battle?
Well, Moscow announced several months ago that taking Bakhmut was its objective. And they set, in fact, a deadline of mid-December, which obviously failed. Zelensky was in Bakhmut 24 hours before he came to Washington, demonstrating that Ukraine controlled that city. Now the Russians are saying they're taking the town of Soledar a little bit in the neighborhood of Bakhmut, but that also has proved to be false. Ukraine has stopped the Russian offensive in Donbass. And this is one more embarrassment, one more defeat for the Kremlin.
Are we seeing some of the challenges that were anticipated with the harshness of winter in cities like Bakhmut and elsewhere where the temperatures have dropped and it has impacted the soldiers, their supplies, their gear?
There's no question that the winter makes things harder, but it makes it especially hard for the Russians because their logistics are dreadful. They have the soldiers who are freezing in their trenches as the winter sets in. Ukraine's logistics system is much better, and Ukrainian soldiers are coping with the winter much more easily than the Russians. And in fact, when the ground becomes fully hard, Ukraine may be able to take back more territory as they can then use tanks and armored personnel carriers to move their forces forward.
Ambassador, we have seen this latest U.S. military assistance package. It includes 50 armored vehicles, 500 anti-tank missiles. How big of an impact will this have on the battlefield, giving Ukraine the upper hand?
This is a plus, but it is far from decisive. The administration is still far too cautious at sending the more advanced weapons Ukraine needs. We and the Germans should be sending advanced tanks. We refuse so far to do so. We should be sending long-range fires. We send artillery with a range of 85 kilometers. We could send artillery and rockets and missiles and drones with a range up to 300 kilometers. This would enable the Ukrainians to push the Russians back farther, and we should certainly do this.
And the reason for the caution is what?
Well, originally it was a fear of quote-unquote escalation. They were intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. Finally, by September, the Biden administration got it straight and understood that we're in nuclear power too. Now they seem to be overly concerned that Ukraine could have too large of a victory, and that could make things unstable in Russia, which is just plain silly. If, in fact, Ukraine has a major victory, the war will come to an end sooner, and Russia will adjust its policies accordingly.
I'm curious, do you see it as a positive sign that there have been 100 soldiers heading home after both Russia and Ukraine exchanged prisoners on Sunday? What does that signify that continues to happen?
Well, that is a good thing. Soldiers and prisoners of war should be exchanged. Generally, the Russians have used these prisoners of war as hostages because Ukraine is more anxious to get their soldiers home than the Russians are. But I think this reflects Putin's understanding that things are not quite going his way, and so maybe he'll try something a little bit different at the moment. But again, his circumstances are not good.
So what are his options?
Well, the real option, which he refuses to take, is to withdraw his forces from Ukraine and establish a just and a real peace. He is still hoping that by launching another offensive, and he's preparing to do that, he will prolong the war and the West will become tired of supporting Ukraine. As long as the West provides Ukraine at least the support we're doing at the present time, the Russians will lose. If we, in fact, increase our support the ways I've just described, send them more advanced weapons, the Ukrainian victory will come sooner. But they're hoping, for example, that isolation-minded legislators in the United States will have more influence and reduce American support for Ukraine, which would be a disaster for American national security interests.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.